everyone. Good morning and welcome to this conference on the future of transatlantic relations organized together by SciencePo in Georgetown. I'm Sergei Guriev. I'm a provost at SciencePo. And I would like to welcome you on behalf of SciencePo. We have here the organizers, Frank Vella, Arantxa Gonzalez, and Joel Hellman, who will say a few words as well, and then we'll move to keynote by Enrique Letta, and then we'll have 4 panels. The idea of this conference is actually to have a honest exchange about challenges in transatlantic relations. The world is in a difficult situation, and what we wanted to do in this one day of discussions is to look at 4 dimensions of those challenges. So we'll talk about issues related to green transition, green industrial policies, which, as you know, are not necessarily addressed in the same and consensual way on the 2 sides of the Atlantic. We'll talk about digital challenges again. These challenges are viewed differently by the US and European businesses, societies, and regulators. The 3rd panel will be on security and defense. Again, a lot of challenges viewed somewhat differently on the 2 sides of the Atlantic. And finally, we'll talk about development and development aid and the relationship between the Western countries and non-Western countries, which unfortunately are somewhat complicated, and they are also adding to confusion and problems in the other dimensions. So that was the idea. We have 2 leading institutions on the 2 sides of the Atlantic which view these issues differently. Both institutions are committed to transatlantic dialogue. Both institutions are training the elites, the future decision makers that need to solve those issues. And if we fail to understand those issues ourselves, the future is in danger. So let's hope that by the end of today, sometime by the time of cocktail, all the issues are resolved, and we are confident that the next generation of Washington-based and Paris-based policymakers are well trained to solve all these problems, because we so far have not succeeded in solving them. So with that, I pass the microphone to Frank.
Thank you, Sergei. So I'm going to limit my comments just to be those of a welcoming nature, and also to express gratitude. First of all, I'd like to, as Sergei pointed out, my name's Frank Vella. I work for the Georgetown University President's Office, and we have this initiative about global economic challenges. And Sergei and I have done a number of events, and this time we thought that rather than restrict them just to economics, I mean, there's other kind of problems as well. So we thought we'd expand them to that, and that's what the idea of this conference is. And of course, we're very fortunate to have worked with Arantxa and Joel to be able to set up this panel, this program with a wider range of topics. First, I'd like to really express my gratitude to Sergei, who's been an extraordinary partner for the last 2 years, and we hope it's a partnership which continues, not just here, but also elsewhere. I've also, Inga, who's in the audience over there, provides just a remarkable level of assistance. Well, it's more than an assistance, actually. It's leadership in lots of things, so thank you very much, because the program's terrific, and so a lot of it's got to do with you. And also, I'd like to thank Enrico and many of the other speakers who have come from the US. I think it's really just a really extraordinary program, and I'm very excited to listen to it. So that's all I have to say. So thank you for coming.
So just yesterday...
This event is broadcast live. So think about what you're going to say now.
For the audience that is following us live, I reiterate the commitment of Joel and myself to bring you a good conference. Let me start where I left it yesterday. Yesterday, I had the privilege of hosting the EU-US Transatlantic Trade and Technology Dialogue with the principals on both the US and the EU side. In what was effectively their 6th round of conversations that started in 2021, September, when both sides realized that the confrontational approach was going to be much more complicated than sitting down and managing the complexities of the world's largest economic relationship worth $8 trillion US. It's pretty sobering, so let's start there. We've put on the agenda 4 topics, but in reality, it's not about these 4 topics. It's about who will end up being. So yes, it's about the economy, yes, it's about climate change, yes, it's about defense and security. Ultimately, this conversation is about who will we want to be in the future. So I leave you to kick off this conversation with the 4 pointers that I took from the conversation of yesterday. First one is, obviously, if we behave like an alliance, we have a comparative advantage. And in the world of economists, a comparative advantage, I guess, is very important. So finding a way to anchor this alliance is what a lot of these conversations should be about. The second is obviously cooperation that is what we will be discussing needs to be nurtured. The low-hanging fruit has already been harvested. So what is required now is the much more complex part of the relationship, hence the importance of investing. Third message is that the divergences are inevitable. Now, to manage those divergences, stakeholders are going to be crucial. And we happen to be stakeholders in this EU-US relationship. So it is also part of our responsibility to contribute to managing those divergences, putting good ideas, good solutions on the table, but also creating spaces where these differences can be put on display, maybe a little bit more dispassionately than in political rallies. The final point that I took from that conversation is that if we work together and if we walk the talk, we have a better chance of shaping the global standards of tomorrow. So these are the 4 pointers that I wanted to put on the table to, in a way, frame the conversations that we take. I'm very, very happy to have you here, to have lots of friends and colleagues in the audience, and also those that are online. Please don't disconnect because the good stuff is starting now. Yeah.
Thank you. And it's just great. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you so much to Sergey and Arantxa and Frank for making this happen. Let me say something. I am Dean of the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. I am particularly pleased to be here at Sciences Po because we are the oldest school of international affairs in the United States. And what I'm sure those of you connected to Sciences Po don't realize is that we were explicitly created on the model of Sciences Po. In fact, the notion of creating the School of Foreign Service was to create a Sciences Po for America at a time when America's role in the world had radically changed immediately after World War I. And its leadership and the centrality of the transatlantic relationship was absolutely essential in thinking about the future of global affairs, and indeed creating a school designed to train a new generation to understand this better, to take America out of its own isolation, which it had been in for the century before that, focuses on its own civil war, its own westward expansion, and not recognizing its centrality to global issues and the centrality of the transatlantic relationship for global issues was really why the school was created in the first place. So it's a particular pleasure to come back to the source here at Sciences Po, but particularly challenging to do it at this moment when the centrality, as Arantxa has, I think, so well pointed out, the centrality of this relationship to existential issues of our planet's survival, of how to handle the political polarization that's reshaping global affairs, the conflicts that we are witnessing that are having such devastating impacts. The centrality of the transatlantic relationship, which is why our school was created in the first place, seems to not have the central recognition, especially in the United States, as it should have, given the economic interactions, the critical economic interactions, the necessity of the strength and flexibility of the political alliance to recognize the differences, but to also recognize the fundamental unity that we require at this moment. And I think one of the things that motivated me to be excited about this conference is that if we, institutions that were created for these very purposes, are not re-emphasizing the centrality of the transatlantic relationship, digging in and understanding what the tensions are within the relationship, but I think even more importantly, whatever those tensions might be, ensuring the centrality of the understanding of that relationship. Because what concerns me most now is how little bandwidth this relationship is given in the American political spectrum. It seems to me almost shocking that despite these tremendous interconnectedness, economically and politically, we invest so little in understanding the core aspects of this relationship. And so that's what motivated me to be a part of it. That's why I'm so pleased to be hosted here, to have you here in the audience, those of us online, and also to see this as part of an ongoing relationship between our institutions in our two capitals to ensure that the centrality of this relationship takes the pride of place it needs to. And given the looming issues in elections in our country, which have and could have tremendous consequences for this relationship. Moving this out of the political dialogue and into the broader dialogue is absolutely so essential. So I'm thrilled to be here. I appreciate the efforts to be that have been taken by both institutions to make this happen. I look forward to hearing from Enrico Letta and all the panelists on these four very important topics today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, dear deans, and it is a great pleasure and honor indeed to move to the keynote of this conference, which will be given by Enrico Letta, who is now president of Jacques Delors Institute, also a leading author of a report on future of the common market in the European Union, former Prime Minister of Italy, and most importantly, like my friends here on the panel, former Dean of the School of International Affairs. Sciences Po is not young, it's 150 years old, but PSIA is actually quite young, and so we now have majority of PSIA deans with us. Out of 3 deans, we have second dean Enrica and third dean Arantxa. Enrica, the floor is yours. We thought that Enrica would talk for about 40 minutes. If you want to take questions during the talk, that's fine. We can take questions afterwards. We have a long coffee break afterwards, so if you are late, it's no problem. I suggest we move into the audience and Enrica comes forward.
It is such a pleasure to be here this morning, but also for a very strange coincidence that the fact that I'm formally more linked to Georgetown in this semester rather than in Sciences Po, because I'm visiting fellow at Georgetown today. And thank you very much for the opportunity to be here to discuss. I think I'll try to put on the table some provocations, because I think the format of our conversation today can be really very interesting if you are able to speak sans langue de bois, as we say in French. And also because we are all holding our breath, if I may say, for this year, 24. So maybe it's the last moment now, April, May, before a long run. And this long run will bring us at the end of the year in which we don't know which will be the scenario, the political scenario. And the political scenario will have consequences. So I prepared a presentation with, first of all, a frame related to the state of play, and the state of play in terms of the relationship between the US and Europe. These days are important because of what Arantxa just said about what is happening in these very days. I'll try to show some figures that are interesting, I hope, for very few slides. So no problem on that. Very few slides where I'll try to give you an idea on the décrochage as in French we say. The décrochage means the fact that the US are running and Europe is walking. And it is, I think it can be interesting for both sides to have an idea on the different perspective on the relationships. And these figures are the figures that I found also in my work on preparation of this report on the future of the single market, small advertising, April 25th in Georgetown. I will present the report in a lecture. And so these figures can be the way to set up the scene and to understand where we are today. The single market was created 39 years ago, and the world was so different, and I'll try to put on the table some comparison. Then, a third point, that is the point related to the electoral rendezvous, the June one in Europe and the November one in the US with the elections, and how I see an asymmetric relationship between these two moments, and the way in which this moment can influence the decisions, the debate, and the way in which the relationship can continue. Then I'll try to have a very short deep dive into the main foreign affairs topics that are at the center of the scene, because of course we are in a moment in which the world is changing, coming back, unfortunately, for some topic. History is back in Donbass, history is back in Gaza, history is back, and we have to know how to deal in terms of tools, of foreign policy, defense, and so on. And then the last part will be dedicated to the relationship between the two, the transatlantic relationship on the industrial and technological side. In these very days, there's this very important rendezvous in Leuven under the Belgian presidency, which is running the European Union in this very period. And I think it is crucial to understand the two different ways in which we are trying to look at that and trying to, and I'm sure that the debates and the rest of the day will be, and then I will end up with a proposal that is a provocation, but I keep it for the end as the cherry in the cake. But why I say that we are holding our breath today? First of all, because of we have the feeling today of a very asymmetric relationship on all the different aspects, on economic figures, on the way in which we are running the most important part of, I mentioned AI, and AI is I think the symbol of this asymmetric approach to what is happening. I think there's the geopolitical context that is pushing us to have an approach that is a very different approach on some different aspects, and there's the feeling that some of these geopolitical discussions are growing the gap, and I'm trying to, in my second part, to say a few words on the fact that maybe it's more an impression than a reality. I'll try to say a few words on that. But let me start with the famous slides, because I think these slides can be interesting to set up the scene maybe of the entire discussion on where we are today in the relationship between the US and the European Union. And I start before slides by saying what I learned, what we, with Arantxa, and thanks Arantxa, because thanks to her, the School of International Affairs is finally flying in with great results after the preparation that myself and Hassam had. When the single market was created in '85, Jacques Delors launched, he was president of the European Commission on 1st January 85. He launched a single market for a European integration that was at that time, first of all, at 10 countries. They became 12 in 86. So 10 countries, and one of the 10 is no more there, the UK. So 9 out of the present 27 were at the beginning. Second, Germany wasn't reunificated, so it was for a completely different scenario, the single market. Soviet Union was there. The name of the European integration was different. The name was European Community and not European Union. We became European Union in 92. India and China were together around 2% of the world economy. We were in a world in which, for a European company, there was no alternative. The only possibility was to develop there in Europe, maybe to expand, but without any alternative. So the single market was created with the idea to expand, to strengthen, but in a world that was completely different from today. So the dimensions today are so different in terms of numbers, and I will show some numbers on that. Today we are 27, and that is, I think, an interesting topic for the future of foreign affairs discussions, transatlantic foreign affairs discussions. The main topic for the future of the European Union is the enlargement. The fact that we have 9 countries in the pipeline, and I can tell you, and if you wish, I would be more than happy to discuss, and I'm sure Arantxa too will say important statements on that. The enlargement will be maybe the most important political topic of the next 10 years in Europe, because the enlargement means a very difficult political set of priorities and topics on both sides of the enlargement. There are in reality 2 enlargements. Western Balkans on the one hand, with all the topics related to Western Balkans, and Ukraine on the other hand. Of course, there's also Georgia and Moldova, but it is clear that these topics are 2 different topics, and it is absolutely necessary to try to talk, to discuss. If I have to say what is the big risk to have in the next future, is to have 2 different languages on the European enlargement in Washington and in Europe, and to have 2 different, I would say, a set of priorities, languages, ideas, missions. It would be a disaster if we are not able to understand each other on the future of the enlargement, because it is clear that this topic is important also for the US foreign policy, and this topic is crucial for Europe. So the dimension and the change of the dimension, that is something that is, of course, important for Europe. It is important for the US too, but it's something that will need choices and political commitment and mutual understanding. I would say underline this point. I will try to underline, following the thoughts I will propose in this debate, some, for me, important takeaways. This is one of them. We have to create a place where US and Europe, we have to discuss about the future enlargement of the European Union, not because it is a matter for the US, because it is clear that it's a European responsibility, but because I imagine the potential conflicts that can arrive from a non-aligned discussion on that. And that could create, in my view, a big problem for the future. But of course, the big change of the single market and the European situation in relationship with the US was related also to the fact that Brexit was, in my view, one of the, I would say, most negative decisions, and created also in the global scenario a big change. I will try to show some figures. So So that is maybe, I move. So that is maybe the first point that is interesting, because you have the two lines, the red one and this one. And I think it is interesting to see immediately, in terms of dimensions, the fact that even with the enlargement, what happened is today the fact that we used the enlargement, we, the Europeans, to stay at the same level of the US. But it was because of the enlargement. And that is very important. The next slides will show that in terms of speed, the US are in a completely different speed. And this is important because this slide is showing that we were able to keep the same level only because of the enlargement. And I think this is important too for all of those who are skeptical on the enlargement processes, on the European Union. The enlargement is decisive to keep the European Union strong enough at world level. And I think it's interesting. Of course, Brexit played a role. This is the UK. And the fact that the UK is out today is playing a big role, of course, in negative terms. And I think this is what I just mentioned before, is the completely different speed in terms of a GDP per capita. And this different speed is a different speed that is very clear. EU 11 is the 12, of course, without the UK, because it was in 93, we were 12. And these figures are showing that the speed and the way in which growth happened was exactly in the direction what I mentioned. It was too much creating the gap. The gap is there, and this slide is showing a big gap. Of course, the fact that today the enlargement created a downgrade in terms of GDP per capita for evident reasons. But this is important to understand. From 93, the gap is growing, and it is growing in such a large way. And thanks to the enlargement, we, the Europeans, we were able to recuperate in terms of dimension, but in terms of GDP per capita, the situation is exactly the one we are experiencing today. This is on population. I think it's interesting because here we see the importance of the enlargement, because the enlargement is creating the plus for the European Union. And we know very well that demography plays a crucial role, and here is another demonstration of the fact that the enlargement played an important role for Europe. But at the same time, we see that the present situation is a situation in which there's a plateau effect for Europe. That is not the case in the US, where the red line is constantly growing. That is not the case in Europe. I can tell you that one of the, for me, most interesting part of my present job as rapporteur on the future of the single market is the problem of mobility of workers within the European Union, where we are experiencing a very high level of brain drain in terms of pooling effect. Countries, new accession countries, losing 10%, 15%, even 20% of the entire population in a one-way ticket. That is, in my view, the big problem, because it is one of the differences with the US, where you have a circular mobility, if I may say. It's not one-way ticket. Here, it is one-way ticket, and the ticket is east to west, south to north. That means that we are creating a central area of Europe, and this central area is around Paris, Barcelona, Milan, Frankfurt, Benelux, and the central area is attracting people from everywhere in Europe. And you are countries, Croatia, the last country entering European Union in 13 and losing 10% of the population in 10 years. And of course, it is the 10% of the population that is more skilled and youngest, and so on, with many consequences on that. This is a very interesting slide because it shows the big difference in terms of dimension of the economy. The European economy is based on SMEs, and this is the one example. You have here the number of companies in many topics, and this is, I think, really interesting. Is a mix Italian-English, but you can easily understand what I mean. But this is the demonstration of the fact that on many important services, give a look to utilities, energy, and so on, it's incredible, the fragmentation in Europe, the consolidation in the US. And that is, in my view, one of the most important topics, one of the most important differences, and one of the most important reasons why the US today are taking advantage of their single market, and we are not taking advantage enough of our single market. And this is interesting because, of course, when we go to financial markets, this is maybe the most symbolic slide. You have the entire is Nasdaq, and Nasdaq is all the European stock exchanges together plus the gray part. That is the demonstration of, and all the stock exchanges are divided in Europe, are separated. So you don't have a situation in which there's a sort of possibility to work together or to be in a consolidation process. It's exactly the opposite. And I think the financial part of the problem is one of the most important element of the problems we have in Europe today, for a very simple reason why when Delors started creating the single market, three topics that are crucial in the US and in Europe: energy, the telecom connectivity system, and finance, were out of the single market. And the consequence of that is today the fragmentation. The figure that we discussed together, Joe, in the library at the school with the students, and I remember the students were very much impressed by the figures of the average number of clients of a telecom operator in the US, in China, and in Europe. And the average number is 467 million average number client for one Chinese operator, 107 million for a US operator, and 5 million for a European Union operator. So these figures are showing that the two markets are so different on so many important issues, like finance, like telecom, like energy. On finance, that is creating the way in which gap is growing. All the investment banking is US today. Stock exchanges are in the way in which I'm showing. And the big consequences are also in other big aspects. Of course, and I move to the financial part of the thoughts I would like to share with you. Of course, there's a big difference in terms of attitude on these topics. The US markets are not only integrated and the EU market are fragmented, but the approach is different. The US market are private equity based. The European Union market are bonds based. And the difference is the risk aversion that we have in Europe and the culture of risk that you have in the US. And in the last period, these differences played an important role, a crucial role in terms of performances. And today, the European performances are on this aspect not only showed by this figure, but also by another, in my view, very important figure, that is the average, the global number of savings of the Europeans, of the European families that are flying to the US without any return. The Banque de France and the European Central Bank calculate that 300 billion euros per year are flying to the US, and this money, this big amount of money, is saving of the European families that are attracted by the most, of course, profitable market in the world, that is the American market, leaving the US, leaving the European Union, going to the US, with this paradox that is, I think, important also for an American audience to be aware of that, because it is creating some consequences in the European, we say, landscape. That is the fact that this money going to the US and going and feeding the American financial markets is becoming private equity, feeding and strengthening the American enterprises that are coming back and crossing back the Atlantic to buy European companies with European money. And this paradox, this circular paradox, I think today is becoming one of the most interesting trends that is taking place, and is creating, of course, a tension, a potential tension for the future. Of course, this tension means that we, the Europeans, we have to act on our own. We have to create our own financial market. And I see there the problem. The problem is, first of all, for political reasons, for two reasons. The first reason is the fact that it's very difficult for any European political leader to put his face aside, or her face aside, to the name finance, and to go in an electoral campaign or in a press conference saying that I'm doing something for the financial system. The immediate reaction is a negative reaction, and it is very difficult to, I would say, to reach some good result without political will on this topic, because inertia, because of the fragmentation of the single market, is bringing to a decline in terms of performances. So we need in Europe to act, but it is very difficult to find motivations and political will. This is why I can tell you that one of my proposals would be to link the financial markets more united to how to finance the green transition. This is the only way, in my view, to avoid that the integration of financial market is considered just as finance to finance. But it can be, and it is really, in my view, the only way, if you wish, we could have a deep dive on that, is the only way to say how to finance the transition. Because the main problem we have in Europe today is how to, I would say, to keep this decision that we took to go green, but going green means putting a lot of money. IRA, when we were together in DC in February, we discussed on that. IRA is working in the US. It seems working. We don't have any IRA in Europe because of the rules. Rules are playing a big role. Because to have IRA, you need to have tax credits, and tax credits are the fastest way to deal with companies. And we can't, because taxation is not a European competence, it is a national competence. So we are back always to this problem of fragmentation, national competences, European needs, and I was saying the second problem is the problem of sovereignty today. And I think this is a typical discussion that is this transatlantic discussion, but it's everywhere. The acceleration of crisis created in all the different countries and in all the European countries, it is exactly I visited all the 27 countries in this trip to prepare the report. I can tell you that the discussion you are having in the US about symbols of sovereignty, of national flag, are exactly the same that we are experiencing in Europe, with the big difference that we have 27 national flags and you have one. And this is, at the end of the day, the true difference. Because yes, you have the states, but I don't think you can compare the different approach in terms of sovereignty. Our problem in terms of sovereignty is that, for instance, on the three subjects I mentioned, energy, telecom, finance, you need to substitute the national flag with the European flag on topics that are topics where we used to have the national flag, the national authority on regulatory supervisory activity on the markets. In each country, we have a national flag there. Here, we have a national flag. One of the most interesting part of my discussions with the prime ministers around Europe was to listen from a prime minister a reaction to what I was saying on these topics. You write, but tell me, how can I sell to my people today that I have to bring my stock exchange without the national flag in a bigger stock exchange where there's no national flag? And of course, when you listen these discourses, I want to be very clear, not from Orban, but from pro-European prime ministers, saying that you're right, I completely follow you, but I have to be voted by my people. And my people, for my people, the national flag is more important than the European one. So I think this problem of the fragmentation and of the asymmetry is, in my view, crucial. So I move to the other points and I go faster. Why I say the asymmetry between June and November, and I'm sure that it will be part of the discussion. For a very simple reason, I'm not saying anything very intelligent, but I think it's important to repeat it, because here the asymmetry is absolutely clear, as it was on the other topic I mentioned. Until now, it is clear, the gap, and there's a gap here too. And I want to be provocative on that. June elections will have an impact very limited in Europe for what I think will be the post-election and the continuity or not continuity of what happened at the European level in the last 5 years. For a very simple reason, because the way in which the European political life is conducted, it is a great coalition activity. It is a grand coalition activity where, at the end of the day, the fact that one party at the European level loses even 10% or increases 10% is not changing anything big in the big pillars of the political equilibrium at the European level. So I don't want to say that the vote of the European voters has no influence. It has influence. But the way in which the equilibrium, the political equilibrium, is conducted is a grand coalition approach in Brussels. And I think this grand coalition approach is obliged to continue with some adjustment, but it will continue. I don't know if with von der Leyen again, I hope so personally, but I don't know the person. But what I would like to say is that the continuity is not under attack. There will be adjustments, but the continuity, in my view, will be the consequence of the after June elections. I don't think the same I can say to November elections in the US, where it seems, but maybe you can convince me of the opposite, that it is a sort of, as you say in French, is a fight between two completely different words and two different approaches, and the consequence of the result will be huge in terms of the direction on the one hand or another hand. And that will have consequences also on the transatlantic relations. This is why I say the asymmetry there is a clear asymmetry. I don't think that the European elections will have any consequence on the way in which the transatlantic relations will be conducted. There will be discussions, adjustments, but at the end of the day, it is not the topic of the elections. I think the November elections will have a consequence in a way or in another way. And this is why I think Frank and Sergei, we have to reiterate our meeting, maybe in DC in January or in December, because it is necessary to have a discussion and to refresh the discussion with the result of the US elections, because I think this result will have a huge impact of all the different aspects. On foreign policy, a few words by saying that my guess is that differences are, I would say, less important on what we perceive in many discussions. I see a huge difference in the approach to China between the European Union and the US. Frankly speaking, I don't see the similar difference between US and the European Union approach to the other big scenarios, where at the end of the day, we tried to have approaches that are not so different in a convergent way. I don't know if it is because of, I would say, the most European Secretary of State that you ever had, Blinken speaking a perfect French, educated in Paris International and French School, and so on and so forth. Biden with his approach to Europe, and so on. I don't know what will be the future, of course, but my feeling is that the resentment we have in Europe today for, I would say, under the pressure of what happened on IRA, because IRA created on that a point of difficulty in the relationships, because IRA is attracting many European companies, is becoming, we say, dangerous for the European sovereignty in terms of, it is something, for the first time, US are doing something similar with the possibility to attract European companies. We never had anything similar in the past. But frankly speaking, I'm not among those focusing IRA as the main demonstration of a US, I would say, dangerous approach to Europe. At the end of the day, I see for IRA what is positive also, the fact that the US decided to go green on many important aspects. And this decision to go green is the decision to apply common decisions that we took. I repeat, I don't know if it is exactly like that, but the feeling I have, it is more, I would say, balanced rather than what I saw from here without. And this is a crucial point. Of course, on China, I have to say, so on Ukraine, on the Middle East, I see more goodwill to converge and to have convergences rather than big divergences. Of course, we have different foreign policies and different approaches, but I see a goodwill to have a convergence. And the way in which we reacted to the Russian aggression to Ukraine was, in my view, something creating convergence. Even the American approach and the foreign policy on the Middle East in the last period was, in my perception, we had the feeling of an approach that was more balanced, with the idea to find a balanced situation, of course, very complicated and very far. But that was the feeling, seeing that from here, from this part of the Atlantic. It is clear, and this is my last part, and then we'll go to the end. It is clear that this discussion about IRA, about the future of the green transition and the role of the European decisions, the single market, future decisions on the transition, and the other main decision we will take plays a role. I know that the discussion about AI also plays a crucial role, and I see there a big gap in terms of approach. We regulate, you innovate is becoming the frame of the discussion. But I would like to tell you that, and I say you, I say the US part of this audience, that it's important for you also to understand that the reason why we regulate so, I would say, fast, immediately, it is not just because of we like regulate. It is also because another important aspect that I think you have to have in mind, and it is consequence of what I tried to say since the beginning. We are two very different systems, institutional, political, very different systems. And in the data of our research, scholar activities, I think the big mistake is that we put Europe in a basket and US in a basket, China in a basket, India in a basket. In reality, on many issues, putting Europe in a basket is a little bit problematic. It's not completely true. I mentioned on telecom, on energy, we are 27 baskets. On finance, we are 27 baskets. You can say, but you have the euro. Yes, we have the euro. But it is another demonstration of the asymmetric situation we have. Because the euro, we have the euro is a success. But I can tell you my interpretation of the last years, the post-crisis, the post-financial crisis. That is, in my view, one of the key reasons to understand the gap and the difference between the two parts of the Atlantic. You had the crisis in 2007 and 2008. We had a similar crisis, private debt, in 2008, 2009. Then you started recovering. And we had the second crisis, the crisis of public debt. And you didn't. And this second crisis was worse than the first one for us, because this crisis showed that the institutional architecture of what we created with the euro, but without a European fiscal capacity, it was a very problematic architecture. And we decided to move in the direction of rebalance and to create part of this fiscal capacity. But because of the end of the crisis, so in 13, 14, the weakening of the pressure because of the crisis pushed European leaders to say, okay, now we stop changing, it's enough. In reality, it wasn't enough. Because today we are, and I can, tell you this gap and this story in a non-academic way, if you allow me to say so in my conclusion. The big problem is the problem of the room. And this is the big difference between the US and Europe. And this difference has a consequence, has a big consequence on our behaviors, our daily behaviors, our attitudes towards risks, and the consequence at the end of the day is growth. And what is the room problem? The room problem is that you know that in case of a crisis, you have the toolbox and the rule book. You know which is the room, how many people have to stay in the room, how they can decide, and the rules of the decision in a Sunday at 9 o'clock in the evening, before the stock exchange morning ahead have to reopen. And we don't know which is the room, we don't know who are the people in the room, and how to take the decision. And this is the main problem why all European leaders and all European establishment today prefer not to take any risk, to avoid to be again as we were in 2011 with the problem to meet in a room. Because when we met in a room in 2011, the disaster happened because we didn't know which was the room, how many people in the room, representing who, and taking decision in which way. And this is today still the problem, in my view. We have some new tools. I don't want to be too negative. The ECB is a strong toolbox, and we didn't have it. So in preemptive way that, for instance, last year, the Silicon Valley Bank crisis, we were able to avoid any consequence. But the true problem we have today is exactly that, the fact that we didn't complete the banking union and all these decisions on the mutualization of the debt are bringing us to know that it's better not to be Sunday at 9 o'clock with the decision to be in a room and to decide who has to be in this room. And so we avoid to take risks. You can take risk, your culture is bringing you to take risk, and the consequence, we see it in terms of growth. And this is today and for the next years the problem, in my view, one of the main problems of the European Union. And we have to address this problem. So we have to complete the banking union, and we have to create a system in which really we work in a united way, and not with a mix between unity, Frankfurt, the euro, Madame Lagarde, Draghi before, whatever it takes, and so on and so forth. It is working, it is a great improvement. But for the rest, we still have all this part of the problem, and this part of the problem is there. My final conclusion and my provocation is that the world around us has changed and is, I would say, bringing us to think that the rational conclusion of what happened in the last years is not to focus just on my report on the single market, but to open up a discussion on a transatlantic single market, because the rationale goes there. With what is happening around us, with China in the present situation, with the, I would say, Putin aggression, and with what is happening in many other parts of the world, is bringing us to think that we need to create a transatlantic single market. We need to strengthen what unites us. We can do it, and on many issues, the Brussels effect or standardization, many other aspects, could bring us there. But I know very well that the political will doesn't. And the discussion in the two parts of the Atlantic are not having this topic as one of the priorities. And I would be more than happy to listen to the discussion today here. Because for me it is very interesting to see if this gap is so evident or not, or if it is just my dream to say rational brings to open a discussion of a transatlantic single market, because maybe it's just my dream and more than that. But I strongly believe that this is the point, and I'm really impressed, shocked, if I may say, that this is not the priority in the two sides of the Atlantic. And all the discussion about transatlantic is only about burden sharing and on NATO and problem on how to pay missiles, drones, and the rest. The key point is that, are we able to strengthen our two communities, our two markets. I think it is time to think again in that direction after the failure of what happened in 15, 16, and so on. But I don't see, frankly speaking, the mood to go in that direction. And why don't we use this day in Paris, in this beautiful location, to start thinking how to get this result? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Enrica. We are eating into a coffee break, but I think we still have time for a few questions. Do you have questions? I would like to ask a question. You mentioned how difficult it is to sell strengthening EU to member state voters, which is quite natural. We have distrust between different states, between voters of different countries, and that is what drives a lack of further integration of European Union in areas you mentioned. And that also is why you said European elections will have probably a little impact, because we should be very honest and transparent. European Parliament is not an omnipotent political entity, to put it mildly. My question is, in previous decades, we would have a European identity because European voters, European citizens, thought about existential challenges. After World War II, Europeans wanted to be together because they didn't want to have a repeat of World War II. During Cold War, Europe and the US were closely aligned because they saw Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact as an existential threat. Today, we have existential problems like climate change, Ukraine, other conflicts, the war in Ukraine, Russia, as an imperialist power. Do you think the voters are waking up to this existential challenge? Your proposal, if it's implemented, needs political will, which in turn, as you mentioned, should be built on voters' willingness to support this integration and alliance. Do you see any movement in that direction at the level of citizens?
My answer is yes, and my answer is that is the only potential boost to go in that direction. The big problem is that we are living in a moment in which, if we are not able to answer the question who will pay and how we will finance the green transition, it will be complicated to boost through the green transition and the climate change. Because climate change in Europe today is partially bringing some discussions in part of our society on worries about who will pay, how does it cost, and so on and so forth. So I think this is why the political decisions are so important on this point. We calculate that 500 billion euros are the need each year to finance the green transition, the changes in the automotive industry, the changes in infrastructures, housing, green housing, and so on. And 500 billion euros, our national debts are not able to, I would say, to tolerate this kind of... So we need to find European money, and the discussion on that is not easy because there's a big gap between those thinking that we have to do it together and those thinking that is just a national problem. But climate change, yes, and I think Putin is the other big issue. Some of the frugals in our, I would say, jargon, we use the term frugal to name the countries from Scandinavia, Netherlands, countries that are against spending money in common at the European level, frugals. In reality, it's mostly on La Fontaine, grasshoppers and seagull. And so we Southerns, we are, of course, the seagull. But the topic is different from that, if I may say, and it is absolutely... But the key point is Putin has become an existential threat for the European Union. And it is an existential threat because it is no more just Ukraine, it's more than that. For instance, some of the frugals launched the proposal of having a bond to finance defense. That was a total game changer. I will use it in my report, of course. It is a great game changer. It's very important to go in that direction because it shows that we need to put together some tools and to have these tools together. I have to say that the experience of COVID was very important because together we were able to overcome the big crisis we had in I think, a very positive way. After big problems at the beginning, but we understood immediately that borders were not the solution. This is the key point. The big problem is how to show that a prime minister rightly has to say, I want to protect my people. The wrong way to do so is to use only the national ground, the national territory, to say it is the way to protect my people, because it is not. I can tell you that one of the most emotional parts of that was the Prime Minister of Luxembourg, a small country within the European Union, surrounded by big countries. And Prime Minister of Luxembourg crying during COVID, saying that please don't close the borders. If you close the borders, you are killing my people because of, in a small country like that, nurses coming from crossing borders and so on. So it is not closing a border that brings you to a solution, but mentally we keep thinking that closing the border brings a solution and a protection. Protection comes from cooperation, not from raising walls. This is not easy in political terms, but we have to fight on that.
And thanks for bringing up the example of COVID. Michelle, there's a question. Let's wait for the mic. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Hello, thank you so much for this wonderful talk. You're very thought-provoking. I'm Michelle Demoy from Georgetown University. So you spoke about the importance of leaders selling the programs and initiatives to their people and how that was necessary. So I wonder where you would put mis and disinformation in terms of priority for regulation. And you think about Brexit and some other campaigns that have really, sort of weakened that message. And so I wonder where that should be in terms of a priority between the US and EU. And from my perspective, it almost seems like it should be first when you think about how to maintain the health of that relationship. And so I wonder where you would put that and how to sort of traverse some of the challenges that exist between our different systems, the First Amendment, et cetera. So where you would see that and sort of whether or not you would classify that as an existential risk to that transatlantic dialogue.
I think you rose a very important point. I have to say that it's true. It is true in in Europe and in US, and it is true, and it will be true, more and more true, with new tools and with what is happening on artificial intelligence. This is why I strongly recommend in the US not to consider that our, I would say, crazy approach to regulation as a fanatic way to, because I think artificial intelligence has to be regulated on, for instance, these topics. Without regulation, without any limits, there's no limits to disinformation. And I think you're absolutely right. What is happening is a creation of, I would say, precedent is a creation about languages, frames that are, first of all, attacking political decisions, science-based, evidence science-based. That is, in my view, today one of the most important parts of the discussion. We have to fight to, I would say, to keep this bipartisan approach in our countries. Otherwise, democracy is really under attack, and I think it's absolutely crucial to go in that direction and to work in that direction. If I can say a positive word on that, I want to tell you that in 2011, I was here, I was preparing the room for Arantxa, and we had many discussions with our students on the European elections, 5 years ago. And I can tell you the difference between the mood at that time and the mood today. At that time, the mood was, the main topic was European elections with the possibility to have as outcome after Brexit, Frexit, Italexit, Nexit, Dexit, and you can... that was the topic of the election in 19. That is not the topic today. This is crucial, and it is very important, because it's a positive aspect. It is true that we are, all the polls are saying that we will have a more right-oriented European Parliament. But because of what I said before, the European Parliament has a big power, but it is run by a grand coalition. It's impossible to run the European Parliament with one vote more than the opposition. It's a system working in a completely different way. You need a grand coalition. And because we have, since the beginning, a grand coalition, this grand coalition will continue with some adjustments. But the discussion at the European level after the election will be on how to run this topic, the other topic, how to adjust this policy, how to put money on this field or on the other field, but the discussion is not about the existential future of the European integration. That is, in my view, something positive. So I am more than open to, I would say, to keep the attention on the topic you mentioned, and in Sciences Po there's a big focus on that, and I know that in Georgetown the same. So I think that can be one of the topics where the cooperation between the two institutions can be really, really very successful.
Thank you, Enrica. There is a question here? Okay, and there will be a question in the back, and we'll move to the coffee break. I hope that when we do our conference in January, this will be not our deep fakes that talk to each other, but still us. But this is not a given, right? So, yes.
Thank you for the numbers, very illuminating. I'm European who happens to have a British passport and cried on the day of Brexit. No, I didn't, because I didn't even believe it would happen, and that's why I cried. I was cross with myself, so there you are. I feel guilty. I was very interested, you've mentioned a number of times that we need to find the money for transition. And that's why it's important to work together. I agree entirely with all your logic about being together, being stronger, and so forth. And I never thought I'd say this, but maybe we need to get closer to the Americans as well. So my question is more this, more figures for you. Today, global GDP, we spend 6% of it supporting the fossil fuel industry, when apparently, according to climate scientists, it would take only 1% of global GDP to make the transition that we need to make faster than ever. Later is too late. It's got to happen now. So I guess my question is, what role academia and international relations to help the acceleration process and to help governments, I guess, stand up to corporate lobbying? Because COP worked. I mean, it exists, but it's actually not being implemented because of corporate lobbying. That's my question. Thank you.
And I suggest we collect the last question.
Thank you very much. I am a Romanian student at PSIA, and thank you very much for the insightful presentation. My question is regarding China. We have seen a lot of politicians talk about de-risking, decoupling, but the private sector not that much. And I was curious to see your opinion on how we can craft a common transatlantic response to China that does not only talk about security, but about economy too, and one in which the private sector is not seen as a spectator, but as an actor as well. Thank you.
Say two very good questions. On the second one, I can tell you that Arantxa knows better than I do the topic, so I'm sure that Arantxa will give answers. But my point is that I see there a potential conflict between the US and the European Union. It is clear that there's a different approach. For the US, China's race is the main existential threat in the future. That is not the way in which we in Europe, we see the topic. We see the problems with the problem of the unfair competition. We see the problems of the technology and the lack of democratic values and the consequences on that. But of course, Europe knows that Europe is smaller than China. And we give that for granted. That is not what is happening in the US. And this is, I think, the big difference in terms of mood to the topic. So for us, we see the problem. It is not an existential problem. Putin is an existential threat. It is clear, Putin is an existential threat, because we understood that his threat to Europe is not just Donbass, it's something more. And I don't know what will happen in Transnistria, but it is clear that there's another potential scenario of war there, and it is. So I think I am for the, I would say, the clear decoupling between China and Russia problems. We can't put together. And that was, I think, one of the most important part of the US-EU positive discussions in the last 2 years. Because at the beginning, in terms also on wording, the idea was China, Russia together in the same basket. I think it's a big mistake. We have to avoid this mistake. And that was a big part of the conversations, the transatlantic conversations. This is why we need to have these conversations. We didn't have for so many years. We need to talk to each other and to understand, to learn. We are so similar, and we need to strengthen these cooperations. And this is what I think is absolutely necessary. And what your question and your very good point, you're right, COP is a good example. In a world in which multilateralism is in a big crisis, COP is a good example, and we have to work on this good example. It is a very good example because COP is, I would say, science evidence-based by definition. And what I see today as one of the biggest threats also to our institutions and to the role of our institutions in our countries and in the world is exactly the attack to the science-based evidence and policies based on science and scientific evidence. And I think we have to work in that direction. We have to establish a link. If I may say, what is a little bit missing is the relationship with the third actor. And the third actor is the media world. That can play a crucial role to that, but is so fragmented today that is not easy, because the immediate reflex is to work with the traditional media, the traditional big brands. Today is very fragmented, but we have to involve the media system there, because if they are allied with this idea of policies and a public debate based on a scientific shared truth or evidence, I think it is one of the most important improvement in the way in which our democracies can work. And now a science-based coffee or